A Lady Disguised. Chapter 1. The Disappearance of Lady Eleanor Fairfax. Lady Eleanor Fairfax did not vanish in a whirlwind of drama, as society might later prefer to imagine. There were no shrieking scenes, no fainting relations, no dramatic pursuit down a London street. She disappeared the way clever women were often forced to move, quietly, swiftly, and with a heart pounding behind a composed face. The morning she left, the sky over Grosvenor Square was the colour of pewter and rain. Eleanor had been awake long before the household stirred, staring at the pale outline of her bed curtains as if they were the bars of a cell. Sleep had come only in restless fragments, broken by the sound of Sir Lionel Markham's voice from the previous evening, smooth, confident, pleased with himself. "It is settled then, a fortnight, and the banns may be called." Her mother's sigh of approval, her father's practical nod, the faint clatter of a teacup, Eleanor's own hand trembling when she lifted it, and then the final remark delivered as if it were affectionate. "You will find, my dear Eleanor, that a woman's happiness is best secured by trusting those who know better." She had smiled in answer, because smiling had become her second language, and then she had excused herself with an even tone and gone to her room, where the engagement ring lay in its velvet box like a small, glittering trap. Now, in the quiet of early morning, that ring sat upon her dressing table, catching the thin light in a way that seemed almost mocking. It was a handsome diamond, certainly. In another life, she might have admired it without dread. But all she could see was the weight of it, years of obedience, silenced opinions, and the steady erosion of her selfhood. She had tried every respectable method of escape first. She had argued the matter with her mother in measured terms, speaking of incompatibility and the importance of mutual regard. She had appealed to her father's reason, pointing out that Sir Lionel's temper was not as mild as it appeared. She had even, at last, confronted Sir Lionel himself, asking him, quietly but directly, whether he meant to allow her any independence in marriage. He had laughed as if she had spoken a charming absurdity. "My dear," he had said, his eyes narrowing slightly when she did not laugh with him. "Wives do not require independence, they require guidance. You have been indulged too much." That had been the moment she knew there would be no negotiation, only surrender. So she planned. Not recklessly. Eleanor was spirited, yes, but she was not foolish. She understood that a young lady of her rank could not merely slip away without consequence. If she ran, she might be hunted. If she was discovered alone and unprotected, she might be ruined beyond repair. If scandal erupted, her sister's prospects would be damaged, her parents humiliated, her own name forever tainted. But the threat that pressed most fiercely upon her was simpler than scandal. If she stayed, she would cease to be herself. And that, she decided, was a different sort of ruin. 2 nights earlier, she had made her choice final. Her maid, Lucy, soft-hearted, loyal, and terrified of doing wrong, had stared at Eleanor with wide eyes as Eleanor unfolded a plain brown gown across the bed. "You mean to go out dressed like a woman who wishes to be overlooked," Eleanor replied, forcing calm into her voice. "Lucy, you have known me long enough. Am I capable of being a contented ornament in Sir Lionel's house?" Lucy's lips trembled. "No, miss, but what if they catch you? What if they don't?" Eleanor had said gently. Then she had taken Lucy's hand. "I am not asking you to ruin yourself. I am asking you to help me leave in safety." Lucy had sobbed quietly, then nodded. And now, on this morning of departure, Lucy stood by the door, pale and resolute. She had procured a modest bonnet and pelisse through a cousin in service. She had obtained, through means Eleanor did not ask too closely about, a set of references written in a respectable hand. A family friend had once spoken warmly of a former governess, Mrs. Langley, who had died the previous year. Lucy, with her cousin's aid, had found a way to imitate the late woman's handwriting well enough for a hurried employer to accept it. It was not perfect, but it might be enough. Eleanor dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with nerves. She pinned her hair into a severe knot, smoothing the strands until no curl dared to escape. She dusted a faint ash-coloured powder over her cheeks, not to beautify, but to dull the bloom of health that marked her as sheltered and well-fed. She tied her bonnet strings with a tight knot and looked at herself in the mirror again. Miss Eleanor Hart stared back. She looked older, plainer, more cautious, and somehow more alive. Lucy thrust a small reticule into her hands. "Your money," she whispered, "and the address of the posting inn." Eleanor nodded and swallowed hard. The household was still asleep. The footman who might have questioned her movements was not yet on duty. The door would open quietly if Lucy turned the key. But when Eleanor placed her hand upon the latch, something in her chest clenched. It was not doubt. It was grief. She thought of her father's pride, her mother's careful propriety, her sister's laughter in the drawing room. She thought of the garden she loved, the music room, the familiar comfort of being known, however incompletely. She was not escaping a place. She was leaving a life. Lucy brushed her sleeve. "Go," she murmured urgently. "Go now, miss." Eleanor nodded once, then slipped out into the dim corridor and down the back stairs. The air in the servants' passage smelled of polished wood and yesterday's fire. Her steps were silent. At the kitchen door she paused, listening. Nothing but the distant tick of a clock. She stepped outside. The cold hit her immediately, sharp enough to steal her breath. A fine mist clung to her lashes. London looked different from the servants' entrance, less grand, more ordinary, as if she had already crossed into another world. A hired hackney waited at the corner. Eleanor had never hired one herself before. She kept her head low as she approached, heart thundering. The driver glanced at her with bored indifference. "Where to, miss?" "To the posting inn at Hounslow," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. He shrugged. "Get in, then." Eleanor climbed inside, drawing her pelisse tighter around her. The door shut. The wheels began to turn. And Lady Eleanor Fairfax, daughter of the Earl of Ashbourne, vanished. The journey out of London unfolded in a blur of grey streets and muddy lanes. Eleanor sat stiffly, keeping her gaze lowered whenever the carriage passed other travellers. She feared every glance might be a recognition, every pause a trap. At Hounslow, she changed conveyances, as planned, purchasing a place in a public coach bound for Somerset. She had chosen the destination not for romance, but for practicality. It was far enough to place distance between herself and London swiftly, and rural enough that a young lady, disguised as a governess, could disappear into anonymity. The coach was crowded. Eleanor sat pressed between a stout woman with a basket of eggs and a young man who smelled faintly of ale. Every jolt of the wheels jarred her bones, yet she welcomed discomfort. It made her feel ordinary, like the women she had observed but never joined. At every stop, she listened for voices calling her name. None came. Still, she did not allow herself relief. She knew too well how far the reach of a determined family could extend. By the time the coach rolled into the village of Langford Green, Eleanor's body ached, her throat was dry, and her nerves were stretched thin. The village itself seemed quiet, a cluster of stone cottages, an inn with a weathered sign, a small church whose spire rose modestly against the low clouds. It looked like the sort of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. Which, Eleanor thought grimly, meant it would never be expected to shelter the runaway daughter of an earl. She stepped down from the coach with her reticule clutched tightly. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. A woman passing with a basket nodded politely. No one stared. Eleanor exhaled. Now she needed employment. A governess without a position was suspect. A woman alone without purpose was vulnerable. She had a name, Miss Hart, and references. She needed a respectable household willing to take her on quickly. At the inn, she asked the keeper quietly if any families nearby required a governess. The man scratched his jaw. "There's Mr. Wentworth," he said at last. "Magistrate. Lives at Wentworth House beyond the green. Took in his brother's girls after the fever. They've had a governess come and go, I hear. Not easy, those little ladies." Eleanor kept her expression mild. "Might I apply?" The innkeeper eyed her. "You can try. He's a fair man, Mr. Wentworth, not one for nonsense." Fair, not nonsense. Eleanor could work with that. Mr. Charles Wentworth did not consider himself the sort of man fate toyed with. He lived by reason, order, and the steady conviction that the world behaved predictably when approached sensibly. He had learned early that emotion, while inevitable, was best managed privately and never allowed to govern decisions. That day, he sat in his study with 2 letters on his desk. The first was from his solicitor in Bath regarding a tenant dispute. The second, delivered by a rider from London, bore the seal of a respectable firm connected to the Fairfax family. Charles read the second letter slowly, his brow furrowing. It was delicately phrased, requesting discreet assistance, expressing concern for the health and safety of Lady Eleanor Fairfax, whose sudden absence had caused distress. It did not say runaway, it did not say scandal. But the implication hovered beneath every polite sentence. They sought her, and they sought her quickly. Charles set the letter down and stared at it. He had met Lady Eleanor only once, in London, years earlier, at a dinner where he had been invited through a distant connection. She had been younger then, laughing with an irreverent brightness that had startled him. She had asked him questions, genuine questions, about his work as a magistrate, and she had listened with a focus uncommon in a lady of her rank. He remembered thinking, briefly, that she would be difficult to manage. And then he had dismissed the thought, because it was not his concern. Now it was. Charles leaned back and pressed his fingers to his brow. In truth, he doubted she had come anywhere near Somerset. Young ladies of her station did not possess the knowledge or the nerve to travel far without assistance. More likely she had gone to an aunt in Kent or hidden herself in some fashionable retreat. Still, he would make quiet inquiries. It was his duty. A knock sounded at the door. "Come!" he called. His housekeeper, Mrs. Elwood, entered with an air of restrained disapproval. "Mr. Wentworth, the governess is here." "The one who answered the notice?" "Yes, sir. Miss Hart." Charles blinked. "Already?" Mrs. Elwood's mouth tightened. "She appears respectable, but I can never tell at first glance." "I can," Charles replied mildly, and rose. Mrs. Elwood gave a short, sceptical sniff and led him to the morning room. Miss Hart stood near the window, hands folded, posture attentive but not submissive. She wore a plain gown and a modest bonnet removed in respect. Her hair was neatly arranged, her face calm. Only her eyes, grey-blue and sharp, betrayed attention held carefully in check. Charles paused for a fraction of a second, struck by an odd sensation, as if he had seen those eyes before. But that was impossible. "Miss Hart," he said, offering a polite inclination of his head. "Yes, sir." Her voice was gentle, educated, controlled. He gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." She sat with quiet dignity. Mrs. Elwood placed papers on the table with a stiff motion, as if presenting evidence in a trial. "These are her references, sir." Charles scanned them. They were competent, warm, but not overly effusive, specific enough to sound genuine. He studied Miss Hart as he read, noting the careful stillness of her hands, the steadiness of her breathing, not nervous, disciplined. "Tell me of your experience," he said at last. Miss Hart answered smoothly. Instruction in reading, writing, French, music, drawing. She spoke of guiding young ladies with firmness and kindness. She did not embellish. She did not fawn. Charles found himself intrigued. And then she asked in a tone of cautious respect, "May I inquire, sir, what you expect of a governess beyond instruction?" The question was unusual. Most governesses asked about wages, hours, or the children's temperaments. Miss Hart's question suggested she understood the unspoken complexities of her role, the social line between servant and gentlewoman, the expectations that could become traps. Charles met her gaze. "I expect honesty," he said, "and steadiness. My nieces have been unsettled by loss. They require structure more than indulgence." She nodded, as if she approved. Something eased in Charles's chest, an unfamiliar sense of rightness. "I will offer you a month's trial," he said. "If you prove satisfactory, the position will become permanent." Miss Hart lowered her gaze briefly. "Thank you, sir." Mrs. Elwood looked faintly shocked by the speed of the decision. Charles, however, had already decided. Whatever mysteries Miss Hart carried, and he suspected she carried some, she was competent, composed, and likely precisely what the household needed. And so, with the quiet closing of a ledger and the signing of a simple agreement, Lady Eleanor Fairfax entered Wentworth House under a borrowed name. The man asked to find her welcomed her as a governess, and neither yet spoke of the truth. Chapter 2. The woman she pretended to be. Eleanor learned within a week that there was a strange comfort in being underestimated. At Wentworth House, she was not Lady Eleanor Fairfax, the Earl's daughter, the future Mrs. Markham, the asset to be placed and secured. She was Miss Hart, a woman employed for her usefulness rather than her lineage. The household expected her to be polite, competent, and unobtrusive. It was, for Eleanor, the closest thing she had ever experienced to freedom. The girls, Louisa and Mary, were aged 10 and 8. Louisa, the elder, had a sharp tongue and a suspicious gaze that reminded Eleanor unpleasantly of certain matrons in London drawing-rooms. Mary was softer, prone to tears, still caught in grief for the parents she barely remembered. The first morning, Eleanor sat them at a small table in the schoolroom and asked them to read aloud. Louisa did so with precise defiance, as if daring Eleanor to criticize. Mary stumbled and flushed, then bit her lip. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "It is all right," she said quietly. "We are not in a contest. We are simply learning." Louisa narrowed her eyes. "You will tell Uncle Charles I am stupid." "I will tell your uncle whatever is true," Eleanor replied calmly. "And what is true is that you are bright enough to be unkind when you feel afraid." Silence. Mary stared at her, wide-eyed. Louisa's cheeks coloured. "I am not afraid." Eleanor's tone softened. "Perhaps not. But you are guarding something. That is what sharpness often does." Louisa's mouth trembled, and then, to Eleanor's surprise, her shoulders sagged. Eleanor did not press. Instead, she opened a book of natural history and began to speak of birds in the hedgerows, of nests and migrations, of how small creatures built homes from whatever they could find. She watched Louisa's expression shift from hostility to reluctant interest. By the end of the morning, Louisa had asked a question, not out of defiance but curiosity. Mary, when praised gently, smiled through her lingering sadness. Eleanor left the schoolroom with a strange tightness in her throat. She'd always assumed she might have been a good mother, if given the choice. Now she realized she could be something else as well. Steady. Useful. Trusted. In the afternoons, she walked with the girls along the lanes, pointing out wildflowers and setting them small tasks, collecting leaves of different shapes, identifying birds by sound. She told them stories, not the fanciful nonsense that left children dizzy with impractical dreams, but tales of courage and kindness. Mrs. Elwood watched her with wary eyes. Mr. Wentworth watched her too, though more discreetly. Charles had expected the new governess to require supervision, perhaps correction. Instead, he found the household settling around her presence as if she had been an absent element restored. The girls were calmer at dinner. Mary laughed softly once, surprising everyone at the table. Louisa still had her sharp moments, but her defiance seemed less poisonous, more like a habit she was learning to outgrow. One evening, as Charles passed the schoolroom on his way to the library, he heard Eleanor reading aloud. He paused without intending to. Her voice carried through the half-open door, clear, expressive, controlled. She read not like a performer seeking attention, but like a guide drawing her listeners into the world of the book. He heard Louisa interrupt with a question, and Eleanor answering not impatiently but with a thoughtful pause, as if inviting the child to think rather than merely receive. Charles felt a curious warmth at the sound. He moved on, slightly unsettled with himself. He had not expected to care how a governess read to his nieces. Eleanor, meanwhile, learned to measure every word she spoke in Charles Wentworth's presence. Not because he was threatening, because he was perceptive. He asked questions that required honest answers. He noticed small things. He seemed to catalogue people's habits with quiet exactness, not to judge cruelly, but to understand. The first time they spoke privately, it was about Louisa. "She is difficult," Charles said, standing by the window in the morning room, while Eleanor reported on lessons. "She is frightened," Eleanor corrected gently. Charles's eyebrows lifted. "Of what?" Eleanor hesitated. "Of being left again," she said at last, "and perhaps of being unworthy of affection." Charles's expression tightened, briefly, like a man struck in a tender place. "You think so?" "I have seen it in children," Eleanor replied carefully. "And in adults." He looked at her then, properly, his gaze steady and intent. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks and forced herself to remain composed. "You speak with confidence," he said. "I speak with observation," she answered. "Confidence implies certainty. I am rarely certain." That earned a faint smile, so brief she might have imagined it. "You are an unusual governess, Miss Hart." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "Is that a complaint, sir?" "It is a remark." He paused, "but not an unwelcome one." He dismissed her after that, but Eleanor walked back to the schoolroom with her heart beating too fast. Not because she feared discovery, though that was always present like a distant storm, because she had felt, for a moment, that he had seen her, and she did not know whether she could bear that. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor's disguise became routine, though not ease. At night, alone in her small room, she sometimes pressed her hands to her face and wondered whether she was still Eleanor Fairfax at all, or whether Miss Hart was becoming the truer self. It was in late April, on an afternoon of pale sunshine, that the village itself began to notice her. Eleanor walked with the girls toward the green. Women paused in their conversation to look. A gentleman tipped his hat politely, perhaps too politely. Mrs. Pritchard, the butcher's wife, smiled with a touch of curiosity. "Governess at Wentworth House," Eleanor heard someone whisper. "Pretty, isn't she?" "Too refined for a governess." Eleanor kept her chin level and her expression calm, but inside, tension coiled. Attention was dangerous. The more she was observed, the greater the risk of recognition, if not by villagers, then by anyone passing through with knowledge of London society. When they returned home, Eleanor dismissed the girls to their needlework and went directly to her room, closing the door with a careful hand. She sat at the small writing desk and stared at the blank page before her. If she wrote to anyone, an old friend, an aunt, even Lucy, she might be traced. If she remained entirely silent, her family might grow desperate and expand their search. She had imagined herself hidden for months, perhaps longer. But reality pressed differently. Her father was not a man who tolerated disobedience. Sir Lionel, humiliated, would be relentless. They would enlist every ally. And in the midst of that looming pursuit, Eleanor found herself forming attachments. To the girls, to the quiet rhythms of village life, to the strange, steady presence of Charles Wentworth. It was the last that frightened her most, because she could not afford any feeling that tied her to this place. Yet she was already tied, not by chains, by gentleness. Charles became aware of his growing interest in Miss Hart, the way a man becomes aware of pain, gradually, reluctantly, with increasing inability to ignore it. At first it was simple appreciation. She was competent, the girls improved, the household ran more smoothly. Then it became curiosity. Her knowledge exceeded expectation. She spoke French with natural ease, not the stilted recitations of a woman trained just enough to instruct children, but the fluent, effortless tongue of someone who had spoken it often. Her manners were too polished. Her hands, though unadorned, were not the hands of a woman accustomed to labour. Charles told himself it meant nothing. Governesses sometimes came from fallen gentility. A clergyman's daughter, perhaps. A widow. But there were moments, small, telling ones, that unsettled him. Once, he found her in the library with a volume of essays open before her. She looked up as he entered and rose instantly, as if by instinct rather than training. Her posture, the angle of her head, the smooth composure of her expression, it reminded him of the women of rank he had encountered in London. He had almost said her name. He did not even know it. He recovered and asked calmly, "Do you read much, Miss Hart?" She hesitated before answering. "When permitted, sir." "You are permitted," he said, more firmly than intended. Her eyes flickered. Surprise, gratitude, something else. Then she inclined her head. "Thank you." After she left, Charles stood alone in the library for several minutes, staring at the chair where she had been sitting. Why did her gratitude affect him? Why did he feel an urge to protect her from... what? Hardship, humiliation, the world's cruelty. He had no business with such impulses, and yet they persisted. The first time Eleanor laughed in his presence, it was an accident. Louisa had misquoted a line of poetry in a tone so solemn that it became absurd. Mary giggled. Eleanor, caught off guard, laughed too, briefly, a genuine sound, warm and unguarded. Charles had been passing the open door. He paused, hearing it. Eleanor turned and saw him, and the laughter vanished instantly, replaced by composed stillness. But the moment had already happened. Charles had heard it. And something in him softened. Something that had been held tight for years. He said nothing then. He simply inclined his head and continued down the corridor. But that night, as he sat alone with a ledger and a candle, her laughter returned to him like a small flame. And he realized, with a jolt of discomfort, that he wanted to hear it again. Chapter 3. The Magistrate's Dilemma. The danger arrived at Wentworth House on a bright morning in early May, carried not by thunder or scandal, but by a simple pair of boots. Charles returned from the village after hearing a petty dispute, two farmers arguing over a boundary line, and found Mrs. Elwood waiting in the hall with a frown sharp enough to cut glass. "A gentleman has called, sir," she said, her tone stiff. "He asked for you by name." Charles removed his gloves. "Who?" "He did not give it to me, only said he was passing through. But he has the look of town about him." Charles's stomach tightened slightly. "Where is he?" "In the drawing room." Charles walked in and saw at once that the visitor was no harmless traveller. The man rose as Charles entered, tall, well-dressed, confident. His gaze swept over Charles with practiced appraisal. He had the air of someone accustomed to inquiry. "Mr. Wentworth," he said smoothly, "I am Mr. Hardwick. I have the honour of representing concerned parties in London." Charles's expression remained neutral. "I see. And what brings you to Langford Green, Mr. Hardwick?" Hardwick smiled faintly, as if amused by the question. "A delicate matter. A young lady has absented herself from her family. They are distressed." Charles's jaw tightened. "Lady Eleanor Fairfax." Hardwick's eyebrows lifted. "Indeed." Charles gestured toward a chair with controlled courtesy. "Then you have not come by chance." "Not entirely." Hardwick sat. "We have received word, whispers you might say, that a woman answering a similar description was seen travelling west. I have been tasked with discreet inquiries." Charles kept his face calm, his mind racing. Eleanor. Hardwick had come close. "How would you describe her?" Charles asked, as if merely gathering information. Hardwick's smile sharpened. "Pretty, fair hair, grey-blue eyes, a manner too proud for her own good." Charles's hand tightened on the back of a chair. "Surely," he said evenly, "you understand that a magistrate's household is not a place one searches without evidence." Hardwick spread his hands. "I seek only reassurance. You have a governess, do you not? Newly engaged?" Charles's heartbeat slowed into a deliberate rhythm. "I employ a governess. Many do." Hardwick leaned forward slightly. "And her name?" Charles met his gaze without flinching. "Miss Hart." For a fraction of a second, Hardwick's eyes flickered, interest. "May I meet her?" Charles allowed a pause, just long enough to make refusal seem thoughtful rather than defensive. "My governess is employed to educate my nieces," he said, "not to entertain strangers." Hardwick chuckled softly. "Strangers? You and I are engaged in the same work, maintaining order. Surely you have received the Fairfax request. I expected cooperation." Charles's expression did not change, but something inside him hardened. "I will cooperate within reason," he said, "but you will not interrogate my household without cause." Hardwick's gaze sharpened. "You are certain, then, that Lady Eleanor Fairfax is not under your roof?" Charles felt the weight of the question like a blade at his throat. He could lie. He did lie. "I am certain," he said, and his voice did not waver. Hardwick studied him for a long moment, as if searching for cracks. Then he stood with a polite bow. "Very well. I apologize for the intrusion." He smiled again, but it did not reach his eyes. "If you hear anything, Mr. Wentworth, you will of course send word." "I will do my duty," Charles replied. Hardwick departed. Charles stood motionless for several seconds after the door shut. Then he turned sharply and walked toward the schoolroom. Eleanor knew something was wrong the moment she saw Charles. He entered without knocking, his face controlled but his eyes intense. He closed the door behind him with deliberate care. Eleanor rose immediately, her heart pounding. "Sir?" "Someone has come looking for you," Charles said quietly. Eleanor's breath caught. "Who?" "A man named Hardwick, a representative from London." Eleanor's face went pale. Charles watched her carefully. "You are Lady Eleanor Fairfax." It was not a question. Eleanor's hands tightened around the edge of the desk. For a moment she considered denial, some absurd insistence that she was simply Miss Hart and he had mistaken her. But there was no point. His gaze was too steady, too certain. "Yes," she whispered. Silence stretched between them, heavy and intimate. Then Charles spoke again, his voice low. "Why are you here?" Eleanor's throat burned. "To escape." "An engagement," he said, not guessing so much as deducing. Eleanor nodded once. To Sir Lionel Markham. Charles's mouth tightened. He had heard the name. Sir Lionel's reputation was respectable enough to satisfy families and unpleasant enough to trouble men who valued decency. And you chose a governess's disguise, he said. I chose survival, Eleanor replied, her voice trembling despite her effort. I knew I could not travel openly. I knew I would be watched. I knew... She stopped, pressing her lips together. Charles studied her for a long moment. You lied to me. Eleanor flinched. Yes. And you placed my household at risk, he added quietly. Yes. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she refused to spill. I am sorry. Charles's gaze did not soften at once. He looked like a man balancing duty and something far more dangerous. Finally, he spoke with controlled force. Hardwicke asked to see you. Eleanor swayed slightly. And you... I refused. Her eyes widened. Charles continued, voice tight. I told him you were not here. Eleanor stared at him, stunned. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that? Charles's jaw flexed. He turned slightly, as if unable to face her directly. Because I... He stopped. Then he faced her again, and his expression was stark. Because I have come to respect you. Eleanor's breath shook. And because, he added, quieter now, I have begun to care for you, as the woman you have presented yourself to be. Eleanor's heart clenched. That woman is not real, she said hoarsely. Charles's eyes held hers. Is she not? The governess who steadied my nieces, who speaks with intelligence, who treats others with dignity. Was that all false? Eleanor swallowed. No, that is real. It is part of me. Then why deceive? Charles asked, and there was pain beneath the restraint. Because the world does not allow a woman like me to be that openly, Eleanor said, and her voice broke. Not without paying for it. As Lady Eleanor, I am a commodity. As Miss Hart, I am useful. Charles's expression shifted. Anger, not at her, but at the truth of what she said. He inhaled slowly. Hardwicke will not be easily dissuaded. Eleanor's face tightened with fear. He will return. Yes. What will you do? She asked, and her voice was almost a plea. Charles looked at her as if weighing his own soul. I do not yet know, he said honestly, but I will not have you discovered by chance. You will tell me everything, exactly what you have done. Who knows, what you have written, what you possess. We will decide what is safest. Eleanor stared. We? Charles's gaze sharpened. You are in my household. If you are exposed here, it will not only ruin you, it will disgrace my nieces. It will invite gossip about my judgment, my propriety. Everything. Eleanor's shame flared. I never meant to harm you. I believe you, Charles said quietly. But intention does not prevent consequence. He paused, then added, in a voice that softened despite himself, and I will not. He stopped, as if the words were too revealing. Eleanor watched him, her own feelings a tangled storm. Will you send me away? She whispered. Charles's eyes flickered. If I do, where will you go? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. Charles exhaled slowly. Then we will not decide in haste. He left her then, and Eleanor sank back into her chair, trembling. She had expected discovery to end everything. Instead, it had begun something far more perilous. Trust. That evening, Eleanor sat in her room with a sheet of paper before her. Charles had asked for the truth. He had offered, perhaps against his better judgment, to help her navigate the danger. and Eleanor realized she could not accept that help without giving him the one thing she had withheld from everyone else: her full story. She wrote it down, not in excessive detail, but honestly. The engagement arranged, the refusal ignored, Sir Lionel's insistence, her father's impatience, her mother's chilling assurance that obedience was a woman's duty. She described the moment she knew she could not marry him without losing herself. And then she wrote something she had not intended to confess even to paper. That she had found in Wentworth House a life she had never imagined, that she had begun to wish, not merely for escape, but for belonging. She did not write the part about Charles's eyes when he listened, or the strange steadiness of his presence. She could not, but she felt it beneath every line. When she finished, she folded the paper and sealed it. In the morning, she gave it to him with quiet hands. Charles read it alone in his study, his face unreadable. When he finished, he sat back, staring at the fire as if it held answers. Then he did something that shocked even him. He placed the letter from the Fairfaxes, the polite request to find their daughter, into the drawer and locked it. For now, his duty would wait. Because the woman he had come to admire was not merely hiding in his house. She was, in a way he could no longer deny, becoming part of it. And he feared what would happen when the world demanded she return to her appointed place. Chapter 4. A choice made in truth. Hardwicke returned 3 days later. This time he arrived with a companion, an older man with a stiff posture and a watchful gaze, a man who looked like someone accustomed to assessing servants, households, and secrets. Charles met them in the hall. "I did not expect you back so soon," he said calmly. Hardwicke smiled. "I have received further information. Rumours are stubborn things. One feels obliged to settle them." "You will not disturb my household," Charles replied. Hardwicke's eyes glinted. "Your household includes a governess, Mr. Wentworth, a woman with refined manners and a suspicious lack of history." Charles's tone remained even, but steel threaded it. "If you intend to accuse me of harbouring Lady Eleanor Fairfax, do so openly." Hardwicke's smile widened. "Accuse? No, no. We are all gentlemen here. I only wish to verify." Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And I am telling you, plainly, that you will not question my governess. You will not frighten my nieces. You will not cast insinuations over my roof." Hardwicke's face tightened slightly. "You are remarkably protective of an employee." Charles did not blink. "I am protective of propriety." The older man beside Hardwicke cleared his throat. "Mr. Wentworth, perhaps we might simply observe her at a distance. If she is not the lady, she will not object." Charles felt a flicker of anger. "You would observe a woman as if she were a suspect criminal?" Hardwicke shrugged. "A runaway daughter of an earl is not merely a woman, Mr. Wentworth. She is a matter of family honour." Charles's jaw tightened. Family honour is often a convenient phrase for control. Hardwicke's eyes narrowed. "Be careful." Charles held his gaze. "You are in Somerset. Here, threats carry less weight than in London drawing rooms." The standoff stretched. Then, from the staircase, a small voice rang out. "Uncle Charles?" Mary stood on the steps, her face pale. Louisa hovered behind her, eyes sharp and frightened. Charles's attention shifted instantly. "Go back upstairs," he said gently, but Mary's gaze was fixed on Hardwicke. "Who are those men?" Hardwicke's expression softened into false charm. "No one of consequence, little miss." Louisa stepped forward, chin high. "You are lying." Hardwicke blinked. Louisa's eyes flashed toward the schoolroom door. "You came for Miss Hart." Eleanor appeared then, drawn by the sound of voices. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Hardwicke's gaze locked on her like a hound scenting prey. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. She had lived in this house as Miss Hart for weeks, always watching the edges of safety. Now, in one instant, that safety shattered. Hardwick's smile sharpened. "Good morning, Miss Hart." Eleanor's voice emerged steady, though her hands trembled. "Good morning, sir." Hardwick took a slow step forward. "You resemble someone I've been seeking." Eleanor met his gaze. "Many women resemble many others." Hardwick's eyes gleamed. "Ah, a clever answer." Charles stepped between them. "That is enough." Hardwick ignored him. "If you are merely Miss Hart, you will not object to telling us where you were employed previously." Eleanor's heart hammered. She could not answer without lies, and lies would sound like lies now. Charles's voice cut through. "Leave." Hardwick turned his head slowly. "Excuse me?" Charles's expression was controlled but dangerous. "Leave my house." The older man's face reddened. "Mr. Wentworth, this is outrageous." Charles did not move. Now. Hardwick studied him, then Eleanor, then the watching children. At last, he gave a slight bow. "Very well. But I assure you, Mr. Wentworth, this matter will not end here." He turned and left, his companion following in stiff outrage. The door shut. Silence filled the hall. Eleanor's knees went weak. Louisa whispered, "They know." Mary began to cry. Charles turned to Eleanor, his eyes intense. "Take the girls upstairs," he said quietly. "Now." Eleanor obeyed, gathering the children with gentle urgency. She soothed Mary as they climbed, Louisa clinging to her sleeve with surprising desperation. "Will they take you?" Louisa whispered. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Not today." But she could not promise tomorrow. That night Charles and Eleanor sat in the study, the fire low, the air heavy with what remained unspoken. Eleanor's face was pale but composed. "They will return with more authority," Charles said. "Hardwick will not leave this alone. If he cannot prove anything here, he may pressure your family to make the search official." Eleanor swallowed. "Then I must go." Charles's jaw tightened. "Where?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I cannot stay and bring ruin to your nieces." "They would be ruined by gossip regardless," he said sharply, then softened. "No, not regardless. But, Eleanor." He stopped, as if saying her name aloud changed everything. She looked up at him. He continued, voice lower. "If you go alone, you will be found, or you will fall into danger worse than discovery." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. "What do you suggest?" Charles's gaze held hers. "Truth." Eleanor's breath caught. "Truth would destroy me." "Truth would free you," he corrected quietly. "Not easily, not without pain, but it would take the power of secrecy away from them." Eleanor stared. "You mean I should return?" "I mean, you should write to your father," Charles said steadily, "on your own terms. Not through Hardwick, not through whispers. You must force them to answer you directly." Eleanor shook her head. "He will command me home." "Then you refuse," Charles said. Her eyes widened. A woman cannot simply refuse an earl. Charles's expression hardened. "A woman can refuse anything. The question is what it costs her." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "And what would it cost me?" Charles's voice softened, and it was almost pain. "Comfort, security, the approval of people who have never truly listened to you." Eleanor stared into the fire. She imagined her father's anger, her mother's cold disappointment, society's whispers. She imagined Sir Lionel's triumph if she returned broken and forced into obedience. A shudder ran through her. "I cannot marry him," she whispered. "I know," Charles said. She turned to him, eyes shining. "Why do you care?" Charles held her gaze for a long moment. Then he spoke with quiet honesty. "Because I have come to value you," he said, "not as Lady Eleanor Fairfax, not as Miss Hart, as yourself." Eleanor's breath trembled. "And because," he continued, voice low, "I cannot bear the thought of you being forced back into a life that would extinguish you." Eleanor's eyes filled. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall. "You do not know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Charles replied, "and I know myself enough to recognize what has been happening to me since you arrived." Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "What has been happening?" Charles's jaw worked, as if the words were difficult. "I have been falling in love," he said simply. The room seemed to still. Eleanor's heart clenched so sharply it hurt. He continued, and his voice did not waver, though his eyes darkened with feeling. "And I hate it, because it is inconvenient and improper and entirely beyond reason. But it is also true." Eleanor stared, unable to speak. Charles leaned forward slightly. "I fell in love with the woman who taught my nieces, who argued with me about charity, who laughed without malice, who carried herself with dignity when no one offered her any. I fell in love with Miss Hart." Eleanor swallowed. "But Miss Hart is a disguise." Charles's gaze held hers with painful steadiness. "Is she? Or is she the part of you that you were never allowed to be as Lady Eleanor?" Eleanor's lips parted. No words came. Charles's voice softened. "But I cannot build love on deception. If there is to be anything between us, it must be in truth." Eleanor's hands trembled. Truth would mean you end the engagement openly," Charles said. "You face your family, you risk their wrath, and you choose your life." Eleanor stared into the fire, trembling. Then slowly she nodded. The letter she wrote to her father the next morning was the hardest thing she had ever done. She did not beg. She did not apologize for wanting freedom. She wrote with respect, but with firmness. She explained that she would not marry Sir Lionel Markham. She explained that she had left because she feared being forced. She explained, carefully, that she was safe, and that she intended to remain safe. She did not reveal her location, and at the end she wrote, "I am your daughter. I honor you. But I cannot honor a command that would destroy me." When she sealed it, her hands shook. Charles arranged for it to be sent through a trusted solicitor in Bath, rather than through village post where Hardwicke might intercept it. Then they waited. Days passed, like years. Hardwicke did not return, perhaps because he was waiting for a stronger authority. Eleanor stayed mostly indoors, teaching the girls and walking only in the garden with her bonnet pulled low. The household felt suspended between breaths. Then, at last, a reply arrived. It was not from her father. It was from her mother. The letter was brief, elegant, and cold enough to freeze Eleanor's blood. "You have shamed us. Return at once. Your father is unwell with distress. Sir Lionel has been patient beyond measure. If you persist, you will leave us no choice but to declare you unfit for respectable society." Eleanor read it twice, her vision blurring. Unfit. A woman who refused obedience could be painted as unstable, hysterical, disordered. Society loved such explanations. They allowed everyone else to feel safe. Eleanor folded the letter with careful hands and sat very still. Charles found her in the schoolroom, staring at nothing. He did not ask questions at once. He simply sat opposite her. Eleanor slid the letter across the table. Charles read it, his expression tightening. When he finished, he looked up. "This is coercion." Eleanor's voice was thin. "It is power." Charles's gaze was steady. "And what will you do?" Eleanor's hands trembled. If they declare me unfit, they can control me entirely. They can send me away, lock me away, force me. Charles's voice was quiet but fierce. Not if you act first. Eleanor stared. You must make your refusal public enough that they cannot bury it, Charles said. Not scandalous, not theatrical, but undeniable. Eleanor's mouth went dry. How? Charles's eyes held hers. By placing yourself under protection that your family cannot dismiss as mere rebellion. Eleanor swallowed. You mean? Charles's voice softened. Marry me. The words hung in the air like a bell struck once. Eleanor's heart hammered. You cannot mean that. I do, Charles said steadily. Not as rescue, not as impulse, as choice. Eleanor shook her head, overwhelmed. But your position, your reputation. My reputation will survive marrying the Earl's daughter, Charles said dryly, then softened. Eleanor, I would not ask if I did not believe it could be right, but I will not trap you in gratitude. If you do not love me, if you do not want this, then we find another way. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and this time she did not stop them. I do not know what love is allowed to feel like, she whispered. I have never been allowed to choose. Charles's expression softened with something like tenderness. Then choose now. Choose what you want, not what frightens you. Eleanor stared at him through tears. She thought of Sir Lionel's smirk. She thought of her mother's cold letter. She thought of Louisa's hand clutching her sleeve, Mary's laughter returning in fragile bursts. She thought of Charles standing between her and Hardwicke, not for advantage, but for principle. And she realized something with startling clarity. She did love him, not as a fantasy, as a steady, growing truth. Yes, she whispered, voice trembling. Yes, I want this. Charles's breath released, as if he had been holding it for weeks. He stood slowly, as though afraid of startling the moment into breaking. Then, with a gentleness that undid her, he took her hand. No ring, no triumph. Just a quiet, reverent holding. They married in the small village church on a clear morning, with only a few witnesses. The rector, Mrs. Elwood, who cried despite herself, and the two girls, who stood proudly in white ribbons. Eleanor wore a simple gown, no diamonds, no fashionable extravagance, but she stood taller than she ever had in London. When she spoke her vows, her voice did not tremble. Charles's hand was steady in hers. Afterwards they returned to Wentworth House, where the household seemed to exhale. It was not the end of trouble. Letters from London still came, sharp and disapproving, then gradually less frequent as the reality settled. Her family did not forgive quickly. Society whispered, then found fresher entertainment. But Eleanor had made the most dangerous move a woman could make in their world. She had chosen. Months later, on an evening when the air smelled of summer roses, Eleanor stood on the terrace watching Louisa teach Mary a dance step awkwardly and earnestly. Charles came to stand beside her. You are quiet, he said. Eleanor smiled faintly. I was remembering the day I arrived here, trembling, pretending. Charles's gaze softened. And now? Eleanor turned her head and looked at him fully. Now I am still myself, she said, but I am not pretending anymore. Charles's hand covered hers, warm, steady. I loved the woman you pretended to be, he said quietly, but I love you more. Eleanor's eyes shone. And if truth once threatened to shatter us, she murmured, it has become the thing that holds us together. Charles leaned down and kissed her, not dramatically, not possessively, but as if he were sealing something sacred. And Eleanor Fairfax, once a runaway, once a disguise, stood in the quiet strength of the life she had claimed, not because she had been spared consequence, but because she had refused to be extinguished. The end,